Sometime in the late 1980s, I made a piece that I titled Displacements. And although I couldn't possibly have anticipated how relevant a lot of that work would be to the problems of social isolation that we have today and um, the address that we take as spectators in a culture of violence versus agents of social transformation, and sometimes combinations of roles that we play as audience to racial injustice in the United States, as participants in the theater of racial injustice in the United States, and as agents of change are so complex and so variable that I think that revisiting this particular piece is of some value. Uh, what I want to start with in this film essay is this notion of engagement and participatory versus non participatory attendance. And there's a kind of relationship between the way that we participate in a theatrical piece and the way that we participate in life that I had tried to engage in this work. Now, this could be taken as theater, but it's really a little bit problematic to call it that. Some of the pieces were installational. Some of the pieces were engaged audience. Some of the pieces merely allowed the opportunity for the audience to decide how they would engage the piece. There were live performances that were part of the work, and all of the audience, if you can even call it that, all of the attendants really were asked to participate in the work in various sorts of ways. Of course, we always will have, right, kind of issues of security and safety and not wanting to engage, the events of life. We're conditioned not to engage the events of life, and this piece wanted to, in some ways, document that, in some ways, challenge that, in some ways, involve viewers and audience members in ways of thinking about their own reluctance or willingness to participate in the events of existence, I suppose. Social events, communicative events, events that involve all sorts of problems and problem solving. So, for example, and I'll explore all of these issues in greater detail as we enter into the piece. But for example, there was a swimming pool, and it was filled with water, and a boom box ran across it, and the boom box was plugged into an electrical outlet. It looked like an electrical safety hazard, and now the outlet had been turned off so that there was no danger. But that little detail of that particular piece, I saw as an invitation for an audience member to unplug the electrical cord from the outlet as an act of social responsibility. There were hot dogs in one of the installation pieces that represented a moment that I had been referring to in a camping trip. So it had reproduced a kind of suburban version of a campfire scene and outdoor scene, and participants, and particularly in that instance, opened up the hot dogs and ate the hot dogs. They were hungry. So that's another way of engaging stuff. If I need something, I take it, right? Um, it, there wasn't a sign that said free hot dogs, but people were willing to assume that they had the right to those hot dogs. So all of the pieces asked for engagement in different ways, or open to the possibility of engagement in different ways. And what we see today is how issues of participation and spectatorship, right, are really political decisions that we make when we encounter anything really in the world, but particularly like extremely like serious presences of violence. And I was thinking how this kind of engagement with participation, I've experienced in my own life in different ways. I had put up a piece earlier this month that documented an incident in an arroyo where police had been called to remove one of my dogs. And in the course of protecting that dog, I was assaulted and arrested. And there were people there, and I remember saying, like, what are you doing? Stop. Why are you doing this? So there was an audience to that, and there was, to my knowledge, no documentation, but to my knowledge, there certainly wasn't any interference, right? There certainly wasn't anyone that came and said, stop, So displacements, I think, in a way, really becomes more relevant today. And I wish I had some of the materials documenting it. I have a few images, perhaps, that I'll be able to find and become part of the piece as we go along. But I want to break it up into pieces because there really are a lot of different issues that we're addressing in this piece. And I want to start just with this idea of audience and participation. Displacement means a lot of things, but let me just take a look at this sort of geometry definition that we're looking at here. So in terms of like spectatorship versus communication action, all right? So the idea of the path taken, right? Let me address this in terms of one of the pieces that I had in the piece. I was babysitting one of my. I was babysitting my wife's co-worker's son, and I had taken him to this was in the late 80s. I had taken him to Balboa Park in San Diego, and there's a very beautiful, huge tree that all the children like to play under, and he was engaged, playing in this tree, and there was a boy there, and this boy was he had a disability, and he was wheelchair bound, and I learned in the course of talking to him, became aware in the course of talking to him that he had some other areas of unique and special abilities, as well as being, limited in terms of his mobility. So he was one of he was one of the events. He was one of the revelations that I had in talking to him. He became a revelation of myself, of what I wanted to do with this piece, of who we are, and the way that happened was I became aware that his participation in playing around this tree, was limited by his particular physical and other aspects of his being that he really didn't have choices over, right? So he couldn't climb that tree. He couldn't engage that situation in the way that the other children were engaging it. And how he became a revelation for me was that I realized, like, that is all of us in a certain sense, that there are ways that we can and ways that we can't engage any situation. And so it's not always a matter of choice that one is either a participant or an observer, right? There are all kinds of aspects of who we are that that determine our engagement in a situation. So I thought of displacement as this kind of like, well, are we able to engage it in the way that it is framed and the engagement is expected? For example, if you go to a museum, you're expected to look at the painting, but you don't touch it. Well, depending on who you are, this could be simple or difficult to engage it in that way that it's defined by the cultural expectations. So this young man had a way of engaging this sort of community event, but it was different from the other children, and he was, sitting in his wheelchair and he was watching it. So I talked to him, and the other revelation that I had as I came up to him was that he was not only bound in the wheelchair, but he was also blind. And so he was listening to the events, but he wasn't an observer in the same way that I was, right? So his trajectory was a bit different than mine was. That green line in as a metaphor of observation was a different line for him than it was for me. So I was able to talk about what the other children were doing in the tree, and answer some of his questions. And his questions were very interesting, not the kinds of questions that I would have expected. At the time, there were some fires that were burning in the mountains in California, and he asked questions about those fires. And are there fires in the mountains? Are the fires being put out in the mountains? Is it cold in the mountains? And we talked in that way, and I answered those questions as best I could. And all of that became a part of this piece because, like I said, this moment was a revelation to me. And I wanted to do something with it. And so I put some of these ideas in all different kinds of context. I had recently been assaulted and by a man in La Jolla, California. And I had put that in as well, because in that event, there were also people present, and there was also different kinds of levels of engagement when it happened. From ignoring the situation to wanting to help me to providing me with a way of, communicating whether I needed hospitalization, all kinds of different things went on. And so that became part of this piece as well. So one of the central things, and like I said, this is what I want to address first, and this is sort of an introduction to that set of addresses, is how do we participate in world and culture